Doctors of Reddit, what made you say how the F is this person still alive? Witnessed a sedan with a trailer flip 4 times at tilde 75 miles per hour on a highway into a ditch right in front of me. A 12-year-old wasn't wearing a seatbelt and was thrown from the vehicle through an open window. He had a superficial laceration of his leg, and was in shock, but otherwise apparently unharmed. We did a quick trauma evaluation of the family. Everyone seemed okay and applied pressure to the kid's bleeding leg until EMS got there. When we were running to the wrecked car as the dust was settling, I was sure we were just going to see disembodied pieces of that kid everywhere, but he was really lucky. Wear seatbelts, folks. Everyone who remained buckled in the car didn't even have a scratch. Both of the stories I'm sharing occurred during the Nepal earthquake of 2015. First was an infant who had a roof fall on his head. He was trapped for 10 minutes before being rescued and took another 3 hours to drive him to the nearest functioning hospital. This happened in a remote area and he was brought in a taxi. His face was so swollen that it was probably more than double its original size. The top of his head was completely flat, like a dinner plate, and he had raccoon eyes. But somehow he was showing no danger signs and his vitals were normal. A CT scan miraculously showed that there was no brain damage or even an actual fracture. He had something called a ping pong fracture. The child recovered pretty well and was discharged in a couple of days. Second was a lady who was roughly 8 months pregnant. Again, the roof of her house fell on her, sadly on her belly. From what she said, she was stuck under the rubble for about 4 hours, and it took a further 2 to 3 days to airlift her to the hospital. An X-ray of the pelvis was done which showed that it was broken badly in at least 4 places. But miraculously enough, there was very minimal bleeding. Someone with pelvis fracture can bleed to death easily, and she had multiple fractures in her pelvis. Nobody can say what happened for sure, but it was thought that probably the weight of the rubble was so strong that it actually helped stop the bleeding due to the applied pressure. More miraculously enough, the baby showed no signs of injury or even stress, even though the roof fell straight on her belly, and was delivered healthily via C-section. I'm not a doctor, but the story of Lemmy Kilmister of Motorhead always makes me go, how did he live that long? Basically he smoked every day since he was about 11, drank an entire bottle of Jack mixed with Coke every day, and when he was diagnosed with diabetes in 2015 he switched to a bottle of vodka every day. He never ate healthy, only exercise he got was performing, and refused to drink water when his doctor said he was dehydrated. He just added more ice to his Jack and Coke. But astonishingly, even in his 60s, in an interview he said he just went down to the doctor and he said his lungs were fine, liver was fine, essentially in pretty much perfect health, not even tinnitus or hearing difficulties despite Motorhead concerts being said to be some of the loudest. Almost all his health problems came during the last 2 to 3 years of his life, and they can mostly be attributed to old age, not lifestyle. He died in 2015 just after his 70th birthday, to the shock of everyone because he was drinking and partying just a couple days beforehand. This guy was seriously indestructible and it's a miracle he lived to his age. Not a doctor but a student nurse. I had a patient come into the psych ward from the emergency department after he had cut off his own right arm from the elbow down with a chainsaw. He only survived because he apparently had some kind of rare clotting disorder that prevented him from bleeding to death. He was severely schizophrenic and believed that his arm was going to grow back. Not a doctor, but firefighter. We had a 30-year-old male put a shotgun in his mouth pointing up to his nose, pull the trigger and survive. We show up, work him, he's breathing, but missing most of his face, and we transport him. He survives and we are all amazed. 3 months later he does it again, but a 22 to the temple, it bounced around and exited through his eye. He survives again. With some mental deficits and a glass eye, but still one of the craziest I've seen. Not a doctor, but I do have a story. Friend of a friend. She was hiking and got a scratch on her leg. Later that night she wasn't feeling well, so she went to the hospital. They said it was flu and sent her home. She went back the next day and was diagnosed with sepsis. She wound up in a medically induced coma and had to lose all 4 of her limbs and have a lot of internal issues as well. She's doing great now with prosthetics and an amazing attitude. I helped take care of an old dude who had one leg amputated, and had broken his other leg, so he was seeing us because of that. He was on oxygen and not being very compliant with using his wheelchair. We were talking with him and he was getting really argumentative. How am I supposed to chop wood in a wheelchair? Was what he kept demanding. When asked how he was chopping wood with one leg in the first place, he responded that he'd crawl into the woods and hop up to chop the wood. This was even more concerning. When the doctor asked how he was carrying his axe, oxygen, and the wood he chopped, he looked him straight in the eye and said, "I carry him on my back." Not sure if he was serious, but he was pretty dang grizzled and looked like he may have been crawling through the woods. Older woman called 911 for chest pain. Her vital signs were, and she had the look that anyone who's ever seen a patient about to die will recognize instantly. Her EKG suggested multiple blockages in her coronary arteries, and we had to put her on a ventilator shortly after she got to the ER because she deteriorated so quickly. Cath lab confirmed the EKG findings: complete blockage of one artery and 99% blockage of two other major arteries. Unfortunately, it was too extensive to resolve with PCI, so the only option was to fly her to the University Hospital in the city for an emergent triple bypass. It turned out that she'd had multiple episodes like this, but not quite as severe, over the last 6 months, and had refused bypass surgery not once, not twice, but 3 times in favor of a Mediterranean diet. Well, at this point she didn't have much say anymore and family agreed, so off to the ER she went. I took care of her again about 4 months later and she actually seemed to have made a remarkable recovery. She triple bypassed a triple bypass. As a student, had a young guy come in who self-inflicted a 22 to the inside of his mouth and passed out. Awoke the next morning, didn't recall the night prior, went to work. 2 hours into work he says he's not feeling right and starts acting odd. Coworkers call EMS. They take him in and while the ED is working him up they notice a mix of clear fluid and blood in the back of his mouth. They call ENT and get a CT head. Shows 11 or so bullet fragments throughout his noggin. The guy was acting by that time completely unfazed. I was very fazed. Kind of a retelling, but one time a cadaver on which I was performing an autopsy had a lung which was flipped upside down. When I tried to flip it to the proper position, bloop. It flipped right back to upside down. After some due diligence we realized the lung was a transplant, and the surgeons who performed the transplant had attached the organ incorrectly. The lung had been fighting to be upside down its whole life in this other man. After 15 or so years, the man eventually moved in a way that allowed it to flip over, resulting in his death. Not really a how the, is this person still alive, but more of a how the, did this person live this long with this condition? Best one I saw was a guy shot in the back, half an inch from his spine. He was totally stable sitting and talking to us. We saw the bullet sitting in between his SVC, aorta and esophagus with injuries to no vital structure. Walked out a day or two later with just a band-aid. Literal millimeter either way and he would have been a corpse, paralyzed or needed major reconstructive surgery. Med student here. My most memorable patient was a particularly pleasant middle-aged man who was flown back to my hospital in the Midwest after suffering a 6-story fall from a hotel balcony in the Caribbean. The story goes this poor fella just arrived at his hotel planning to spend a week in paradise. Immediately upon arriving to his hotel, he stepped out on his balcony to watch the sunset and leaned on the railing only to have it collapse underneath him. He fell 6 stories straight down and suffered bilateral open tibial pilone fractures, which are particularly high energy and difficult to heal. The poor guy apparently fell into a locked backyard and his wife and kids had to listen to him screaming in pain and bleeding for over 2 hours before they could get the fire department to break down the gate. He was taken to the hospital on the island he was staying where he was stabilized and they recommended he have both legs amputated. He begged to be shipped back to the United States, and apparently, the government got involved and flew him to Miami where he was, externally fixated, and transfused several times. I guess he had some internal trauma as well. About a week later, he was shipped up to the Midwest to my hospital. Literally blew my mind this poor guy went through just because he wanted to enjoy a vacation. Sadly, I think that he ended up losing one of his legs anyways because his wounds wouldn't heal and he ended up with osteomyelitis, bone infection. A few years back my wife was doing clinicals at the local hospital while still in school and a guy came in with a blood sugar of 9. And he was totally conscious/lucid. As a type 1 diabetic myself I almost fell off my chair when I heard that. 15 years ago my mom dated a guy who had both a brain tumor and leukemia. To treat the leukemia they had to stop treating the brain tumor and vice versa. He was given 2 years to live. He told my mom that he needed to focus on getting his affairs in order and spend time with his kids. They'd only been dating a few months, very casually. Saw the dude a few weeks ago, still kicking. Still has the tumor. They successfully treated the leukemia, but now he has osteoporosis? And a sort of not epilepsy? They found out he had brittle bone when he had a seizure and broke a lot of bones falling down. But Hess just getting on with it. Couldn't kill the guy with an axe. Maybe he was just bad at breakups so invented an elaborate ruse. I'm still fairly new in my training but one of the first crazy recoveries I've seen. College kid was out drinking with his buddies and had a bit too much to drink. He presumably aspirates some of his, and it causes this massive inflammatory reaction in his lungs called ARDS. He goes from perfectly healthy to being on death's door within an hour. He gets transferred to our ICU in the middle of the night, completely unstable, on a ventilator, maxed out on 5 pressors, life support meds to keep your blood pressure up, and is being considered for ECMO. His parents are on a last-minute flight from out of state with no bags packed to get to their son. Our team is concerned that he won't make it through the night, and braces friends for the worst. The treatment for ARDS is actually something called proning, which is when you literally just flip the patient onto their stomach. And miraculously, 2 hours later he is off all pressors, maintaining his own blood pressure, and, while very sedated from all the meds, he's able to respond to voice and shake and nod his head to questions. He makes a full recovery 4 days later. And vowing to stay away from alcohol for a while. Working in an Aboriginal community, a woman walked in complaining of a headache behind her eye. She was told to take a seat, and as she turned around she had a butter knife sticking out the back of her skull. Apparently a drunk relative came home and stabbed her while she slept. How strong do you have to be to stab a butter knife through someone's skull? ER nurse here. The one that immediately stands out in my mind was the diabetic who was, of course, non-compliant with her regimen, and came in feeling like, because her blood sugar was high. How high? Try just below 1,300. For reference, diabetics are supposed to manage their blood levels and keep them no higher than 180, and even that's kind of pushing at the limit. By all accounts, this girl should have been in a diabetic coma. At best. Yet somehow she was conscious, walking, talking, and arguing with us every step of the way. Despite the fact that her pee was almost pure sugar, and resembled crystallized honey, it was a 20-minute argument to get her to stop drinking her Diet Mountain Dew. She firmly believed that the fact that it was diet meant it was fine. Her blood was syrup. How we got enough to run blood tests was a minor miracle in itself. She kept complaining and asking for snacks and junk and just. She was not a pleasant person at all. Obviously, she gets to go up to the ICU. 20 minutes after we get her up and transferred, she walks out of the hospital. Why? She was mad that they only would give her water to drink. Priorities, I guess? Haven't seen her since, but I still wonder about her from time to time. Not a doctor, but worked 7 years in an inpatient psych ward. Had lots of alcoholics come in. One came in drunk but walking. His BAC when tested was 68. He was awake and mostly walking. Another man took a circular saw to his inner thigh. Got 1.5 inches and all the way across. Somehow missed the femoral. Crazy, lived and had a sense of humor on day 2. Not a doctor. But March 2018, my father, who is a type 2 diabetic, ended up in the ER because of high blood sugar. Don't remember the exact number, but his blood sugar was over 1,000. Handfuls of doctors and nurses told me that was easily the highest blood sugar reading they'd ever witnessed. They couldn't believe he was alive, or at least not in a diabetic coma. His blood was the consistency of syrup. You know those big, 16 to 18-inch kitchen knives that everyone has? Had a lady come in with one sticking sideways out of her neck, handle on the left side and top sticking out the right. She went to OR, where they removed the knife in one of the most tense, clenched moments in history. Minimal bleeding. Apparently the knife split right between her major blood vessels and airway. Was lying right against them, didn't scratch M. Absolutely incredible. Had a lady walk into the hospital with her face pointed at her chest. Her C1 vertebra had somehow fallen off C2, with her spinal cord delicately draped across the odontoid process. No damage to anything. Repaired with slow traction and a halo for a little while. Still baffles my mind 5 years later. My dad walked a mile to see a friend and tried to walk up the stairs. Couldn't get up one step. Walked back 1 mile to his office, looked up who his doctor was, since he hadn't seen one in 20 years, and drove there. No appointment. Drive hooks him up to an EKG, but it's fine. Tells him Teresa, cardiologist next door, it's the end of the day, they'll see him. Just in case. They hook him up to a blood pressure monitor while Hess on a treadmill. The monitor is behind him, he can't see it. He starts walking. They set a countdown timer for 3 minutes, and about 30 seconds in, one of the nurses steps out of the room. My dad is watching the timer and it counts down to 0. He feels fine and figures Hess going home, but the door opens and 2 ambulance attendants are wheeling in a gurney. While he was on the treadmill, his blood pressure dropped to 0, then restarted, then dropped to 0 again. The nurse who stepped out of the room dialed 911. They let him finish because they figured as soon as he stopped, the heart attack would start in earnest. Quadruple bypass later and he lived, but note, he said he never felt the same. A bypass is not a panacea. Infantry guy in Afghanistan in 2009. Some old guy came up to us in a bazaar and asked us to give him a ride to a city. His arm was wrapped up. We said no, since we don't exactly do that. He unwrapped his arm. His hand/wrist was missing and his 2 arm bones were exposed and white. Everything else was green and black. I have no idea how he was alive, much less up and walking around. I'm not a doctor, but I was diagnosed with Addison's at age 13 or so. Was just generally feeling lethargic, vomiting, dizzy. Mom calls the hospital with symptoms and they said if I had all 3 at the same time to come in to be safe. Orderly or whatever checks my pulse in the lobby. 30:15, he laughs, well this one's broken, and gets another machine. 30:15, wait. What? Calls a doctor, they double check it and run me to the ER for fluids. Again, not a doctor here, but apparently that's not even high enough to have a pulse. They had no clue how I was walking, let alone conscious, but saw the numbers and after realizing it was accurate they freaked the hell out. And of course that freaked my mom out. Them telling my mom 30:15 is the BP of a dead person did not help. And then they said it's either autoimmune or cancer. My immune system apparently ate my adrenal glands, now I'm on meds for life, lucky me. On the bright side though, I never really have to worry about high blood pressure. My resident called me urgently one night and said I needed to come to the hospital. A young man was cut in half by a train. I asked why I needed to come in, there was no way he could survive that. She explained that somehow he was maintaining his pressure and wasn't bleeding out. When I arrived, I found that the force of train had sealed off all the major vessels from the pelvis down. For me it was a guy who was cleaning his loaded shotgun and it blew half his face off, jaw and all. He was actually pretty good from the mid-nose up. The thing that surprised me is how good of shape he was in afterwards. He didn't even go to the ICU, we just admitted him to the med/surge floor. He was up communicating via whiteboard within a few hours and was adamant that he did not try to kill himself. Got a psych consult anyway, but they agreed. Another inch dorsal with the barrel of that gun and he would have been done for. Work in a hospital. A guy showed up who had burst a tire going 180 kilometers per hour and flipped his car multiple times. His car was a write-off. The only injuries he got were a few scratches and a bruise. When I was in college, there was a kid that exited a freeway at near freeway speed. Problem was, it was a construction zone at night, no lights, and it wasn't supposed to be an open exit. Drove right into a pile of rebar. One of the poles went through the car into his face and pinned him to the seat through his head. A couple of years later, I was in grad school, in anatomy seminar, and the surgeon presented that kid's case as a study. Not only did he live, the rebar had slid right past the base of the brain/spinal column. It was so close, they had to twist it out like a screw because the ribbing on the bar threatened nerve damage. They literally rebuilt this kid's skull around his brain. His recovery photo was a totally normal kid smiling. He had a small scar on his chin. I say kid, but he was like 17, just to be clear. Not a doctor. A classmate of mine in HS was out snowmobiling in the middle of the night. He was going about 50 miles per hour down a trail. Some had put a chain across the trail just to be in. He didn't put reflectors on it and it wasn't even on his own land. It was on state land. Unfortunately, my classmate had a backrest on his sled. The chain hit him square across his chest. It slammed him into the backrest, which fortunately broke off. He rode back home and crawled into bed. Later, his mom made him go to the local clinic that had a small ER. They life flighted him down to Duluth immediately. He had a ruptured spleen, part of his liver was torn, his heart was badly bruised, and he had a collapsed lung. He was bleeding pretty bad internally. The doc told him that, if he hadn't been so muscular, he would have died out on the trail. The man was about 6 feet and 245 pounds and ripped like a bodybuilder when he started. 6 months and a bunch of surgeries later, he was maybe 130 pounds. He looked like death and his whole chest was railroad tracks. They had his chest twice to deal with his heart and opened up his abdomen numerous times to deal with infections. Now, Hess the same loud crazy person he always was. A successful business owner with a wife and kids. Everyone thought he was going to die. Including the doctors, but he pulled through. Any of the patients with flesh-eating bacterias and massive debridements, those are always a good source of what the fuckery. An unlucky/lucky guy forgot his keys and was climbing back into his own apartment through the window. His cousin/friend thought that he was an intruder and pointed a gun at him and pulled the trigger as the unlucky/lucky guy opened his mouth to say don't shoot. The bullet went into his mouth and clean exited the back of his neck. After surgery, he was totally fine in a few days, somehow missed all major structures. Didn't even chip a tooth. Really, at his cousin. From my neurosurgery rotation in med school. A guy I know with cancer smokes 2 packs a day and drinks a fifth of Fireball every day. He lives in a trailer so dirty there is a half inch of dirt according to his wife's mother. He recovered from surgeries in that trailer. Eventually we got word he was quitting chemo and was just going to accept death. 5 years ago he was given 2 months to live. He is now completely cancer-free. Life is just weird sometimes. Do that stick out? Guy gets shot in the abdomen, drops to his knees, shooter puts one through the top of his head near his forehead. Bullet exits through his jaw. He wouldn't stop complaining about how much he hates that the guy who shot him. Young girl driving a car gets T-boned on the passenger side by an Altima going at least 70 miles per hour. Her car looks like it was hit by an ARDS, so we assumed she was deceased upon arrival when the other crew on scene said our focus was extricating the people in the Altima. Girl driving was completely unhurt. Buy a Volvo. Another weird world of genetics post. Got a sample involving some kind of offbeat case, where they wanted prenatal paternity testing plus analysis from my company without telling us anything about the patient and the background, as sort of a blind verification thing. The paternal test results strongly suggested that the prenatal sample appeared exclusively paternal. The fetus only had one set of autochromosomes. Humans have, usually, 2 sets. At this point we decided to stop referring to the prenatal thing as a fetus because genetically, this is generally incompatible with life. The answer: it was DNA from the products of Molar pregnancy, which I highly encourage no one to read more about, as it's pretty creepy. Not a doctor, but my former step-uncle used to work on towers, like cell phone towers. His harness broke and he fell, landed straight on his back. Doctors said he was lucky to make it to the hospital alive and wouldn't live. 6 months later Hess walking and talking again. He just has short-term memory issues and his speech is slowed down. But he can still function and be a dad. My grandfather, he had one eye from a roofing nail that flew up and destroyed it, a large scar on his forehead from an axe head flying off and the blade side hitting him, prostate cancer, and oh yeah, he was hit by a train in his truck and was in a body cast from his armpits down for almost a year in the 50s. He lived till 96. Obligatory not a doctor, but I am a medical radiologic technologist, and work in a cardiac cath lab with doctors. Had a patient that didn't wake up from their catheterization, which isn't normally done with anesthesia. We just give fentanyl and versed. We administered some Narcan to try and wake her up, which it thankfully did. When she woke up, she freaked the out and told us that in order to calm her nerves before the procedure, she did a line of cocaine before coming to the hospital. For her heart catheterization. People are incredible. Our nurse literally asked her if she was trying to kill herself because that's a damn good way to do it. Used to be an EMT. Guy was stabbed in the face with a kitchen knife. Split one eye in half. X-ray showed the knife missed his brain and the tip of the blade was less than a cm from his brain stem. Lost the eye and lived to tell about it. I understand he also broke up with his girlfriend. My wife treated a foreign student at the university she worked at who took some drug, I don't recall which, thought he could fly, and jumped out a 3rd floor window, landing directly on his face. He went into a coma and when they x-rayed him, or some other scan, they found he'd aspirated all of his teeth. It took days to figure out who he was and over a week to contact his family. I have leukemia and every doctor who I tell my story to says they don't know how I am alive and they've never seen numbers like mine. What leukemia does in very basic terms is it messes up your white blood cells and rapidly creates them. There isn't room for actual red blood cells, white blood cells, or platelets. Those help clot when you get a cut to stop bleeding. The normal range for white blood cells is anywhere from 7 to 10, in thousands. I had 532. They don't know how I was functioning semi-normally or even still alive with that number. Not a doctor, but I am a physical rehab person. I had a patient once who went on a 3-day coke bender and did so much cocaine he had both a heart attack and a stroke. He was up and walking the week after and all his residual awkwardness pretty much cleared up. He was taken off my caseload before his discharge, but last I heard the only remaining problem he had was that he could no longer speak. I still think about how much coke he had to do to get that bad. Not a doctor. My older cousin got rear-ended at a traffic light. They took her to the ER for a basic checkup. She had no major injuries except they saw on the X-rays that she had broken her neck, and on top of that they saw that she had previously broken her neck and it had healed. She had to do the halo thing where they put screws in her head. Her family does not know of any previous accident that would have given her the first broken neck. She was always in sports all through school and college. No sports injuries. She survived having 2 broken necks. She was never paralyzed. She is perfectly healthy now. Hey, thanks for subscribing and liking. It really means a lot to me. While you are here, feel free to hop on over to the last video. See you there. Ronnie.